And the topic that I'm going to be addressing this afternoon is framed in terms of a question: how should we make sense of U.S. foreign policy under Trump? And I mean, there's a sort of straightforward, easy answer, which is like, I don't know, it's just crazy, it's insane. I mean, how can you make sense of that? And I could sort of enumerate a whole bunch of policies that seem bizarre and unconventional and problematic and talk about them, but I actually want to take the challenge of trying to explain it and make sense of it quite seriously. And what I want to do is, rather than just entertaining the temptation to reduce it to idiosyncratic characteristics of Donald Trump's personality, I want to actually look at some of the process-related and structural factors that bear on how U.S. foreign policy is made at present, up to and including certain, personality traits of the president himself, which I think are important. So rather than a sort of laundry list of policies that I'm going to sort of list and then freak out and complain about, that would be very easy to do, I want to instead kind of organize this in terms of kind of three, as I take them to be, sort of three drivers of, or three kind of characteristics of U.S. foreign policy making at present. One, and I'll start with kind of the personality-driven one, since that's the obvious one. I think what we have here in the case of Donald Trump himself is a certain form of political narcissism that is fed by and possesses an anti-establishment mandate. At the time that Trump was being convinced to run for president, I think some of those whose ideas were informing him and those who were seeking to co-opt him and deploy them for their own strategic purposes, people like Steve Bannon, were essentially sort of telling him that, look, so much of U.S. policy, including U.S. foreign policy, is, encumbered by certain attitudes that are the conventional positions of a deep state establishment that can't think outside that box and doesn't have the capability, whereas you, Donald Trump, you will be able to cut through that and just, push that conventional wisdom aside and do things that no one else could possibly do. And I mean, Trump, I think, was quite happy to kind of consume and allow that kind of framing of him to kind of feed his own approach to these things. And so, I think around particularly issues like the North Korea nuclear efforts, I mean, that's very much how I read, the kind of approach that Trump has taken to an issue like that. So, and I think we can see this sort of narcissism coupled with anti-establishment mandate popping up in various ways in relation to a variety of issues. But the two other kind of current drivers and ways of thinking about U.S. foreign policy that I really want to kind of invest in terms of their explanatory power, because to my mind, this is really how I'm making sense of a lot of what I'm seeing, is to regard a lot of current U.S. foreign policy rhetoric as a form of domestic political performance. That rather than Trump and his administration announcing certain things and doing certain things, or in many cases, as it actually turns out to be, announcing very grand-sounding things, but then not actually following up or doing anything about them at all, a lot of that stuff, I think, is primarily designed to serve certain political constituencies domestically in the United States that the president is trying to secure, to mobilize, to get fired up. So, for example, a lot but not all of the moves with respect to the Israel-Palestine situation, I think, are very heavily designed to consolidate and re-energize support within conservative evangelical Christian circles in the United States. I think a lot of the effort that the U.S. State Department has put into kind of placing a premium on promoting international religious freedom around the world with a often subtextual and sometimes not too subtextual emphasis on the protection of Christian communities around the world, likewise kind of serving the same kinds of purpose. And so it strikes me that there is this consistent pattern over the last 3 years where a lot of these very kind of bold and dramatic sounding announcements about fundamental shifts in U.S. policy around a range of issues around the world are actually primarily trying to serve U.S. domestic political purposes. There's also something that's been going on, I think, around what we might call an inversion of the conventional policymaking process. And this is something that I've come to be aware of as I have continued to communicate with and stay in touch with former career officials at the U.S. State Department and other U.S. government national security and foreign policy agencies. The kind of conventional policymaking process is one where the idea or the need to do something new or respond to a situation in the world in a given way, originates either with, the upper echelons of the decision-making process, the White House or the 7th floor of the State Department, or somewhere in the bureaucracy. And there's then a broad process whereby all of the stakeholders within government and in the bureaucracy itself systematically examines and works through, provides input to that idea such that by the time it reaches a decisional point, or certainly by the time it reaches something that is publicly announced as a policy, it has been thoroughly socialized and vetted and shaped by the bureaucracy, with all of that bureaucracy's equities already having been reflected in the way that the policy itself has been shaped and sculpted before it meets the world. What I think we've seen under the Trump administration repeatedly now is a series of episodes where in some often quite major policy shift is announced, and the vast, the entire U.S. government bureaucracy that would be in charge of carrying out and implementing that policy learns about it by tweet at the same time as the rest of the world. And so, some of the things that this has been the case, and this then that does get back to, some of the things that I work on in my own research and that I also worked on in government. You may be aware that there's been this on-again, off-again discussion in the Trump administration about designating the Muslim Brotherhood as a foreign terrorist organization. Now, the foreign terrorist organization designation process is a very specific technical mechanism that involves the involvement of dozens of U.S. government agencies. There's a very specific process that you go through. Aspects of it are very legalistic, and it's done kind of very carefully and meticulously. And so usually the announcement of something like an FTO designation, just that the government is thinking about it, is never done publicly until there's been enormous amount of effort already placed into a certain amount of examination and exploration of whether there's a meaningful case to be made here. It's the kind of thing where you don't even announce you're thinking about doing it until you've gone through most of the steps that are necessary to do it. But with respect to both times in the spring of 2017 and then again earlier, I guess in 2019, when this Muslim Brotherhood designation thing came up again, and I reached out to my friends in government that I knew would have been at the forefront of the bureaucratic implementation of that. They all explained to me that they heard about it at the same time as the president started talking about it publicly. None of the groundwork had been done. And they then recounted to me, a situation where, having announced it, they're then told to look into it, even though the results of that that examination already foretold because they'd done it previously. And so, the Trump administration announces this, the bureaucracy is told to look into it, the bureaucracy comes back with the answer, we don't have any information or evidence that would suggest that something called the Global Muslim Brotherhood is a foreign terrorist organization. Also, by the way, what is the Global Muslim Brotherhood? How do you designate that? You mean the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood? No, we don't mean that. The Global Muslim Brotherhood. What is that, right? And so what you're seeing, I think, reflected in policymaking is, talking points of people like Frank Gaffney and Pamela Geller that have sort of conjured up and convinced a certain segment of American political opinion that there is this thing called the Global Muslim Brotherhood that is a structure. And so, that then gets reflected in U.S. foreign policy discourse, even though the ability to kind of frame an actual policy question in those terms just seems entirely mismatched. And so I think there's another example there of sort of policy announcements that are designed primarily to drive a domestic political opinion. And that sort of inversion of the conventional policy process, I think, is also something that connects to, and this is kind of where I want to begin to wind down and end my remarks, is to kind of talk about what I see as what for me are the medium to longer term concerns that I have, because I think there is a lot of theater and performance and drama here that is grandstanding and big announcements that don't necessarily lead to much. But there are also aspects of the way that the current administration has been approaching its conduct in the wider world that I think do have longer term effects. And so there's sort of four that are of particular concern to me kind of going forward. One, I think, is a sense in which the U.S. is telegraphing to the wider world a devaluation of multilateralism. The idea that working in concert with and through intergovernmental organizations to pursue some conception of the public good or even shared goals with like-minded partners around the world, is something that the United States is less interested in. I think is harmful not just to longer-term U.S. foreign policy interests, but I think will have longer-term detrimental effects for the capacity and resilience of the international system to address various global issues that are not so much tied to the specific national security interests of one company, but things like climate change, challenges that confront humanity as a whole. And I think tied into this also is a second and related concern about a growing sense of inconsistency and unreliability, a growing sense that the United States going forward is likely to be increasingly inconsistent and reliable as a country able to help to shape the course of world events in positive ways. Obviously, there are all manner of ways in which U.S. foreign policy has been problematic and harmful around the world in some respects. I think there are other aspects of the way that international norms and regulatory mechanisms have been shaped over the last 60 to 80 years, where the United States has played an important leadership role, and where even countries that have had concerns and differences with the U.S. on various issues have ultimately still fallen on the side of seeing the United States as, on balance, a force for good in the world. And as I continue to have conversations with countries, with foreign ministry officials in countries that have been some of the closest international partners of the United States, and ask them how they are making sense of the Trump administration, as in, are you viewing this administration as an aberration, as an outlier, and afterwards the U.S. will revert to a norm that you're more comfortable with, or are you treating this as symptomatic of a broader shift and a more permanent, enduring shift in the engagement and orientation of the United States in the world. And I've been alarmed to hear that more and more, when I asked these same people about how they viewed the George W. Bush administration, the answer I tended to get was, no, that's just an aberration, and you'll get back to normal. And the sort of coming of Obama afterwards seemed in their mind to reconfirm that. When I ask that same question now, what I'm hearing is, no, we actually think that there's something wrong with your country going forward. And we are going to have to start looking at alternative ways of addressing and dealing with world issues. So that I think is a significant shift. The final two things that I want to touch on are, one is very kind of institutional, almost technocratic, but I think it's among the most worrying stories that you won't hear much about in terms of the future of American diplomacy, and that is essentially the hollowing out of the middle and upper middle ranks of U.S. diplomatic capacity. The fact that, an institution like the U.S. Department of State relies on those people that have been in the system for a long time, understand how diplomacy is wired, for both institutional memory and just their ability to navigate complex situations that emerge. And what we've seen under the Trump is large numbers of those people leaving government, either out of disillusionment with the direction of U.S. foreign policy, or because the current administration has, it seems at times, deliberately plateaued their careers in the sense that, they might naturally move on to be appointed as ambassador, but it's been made clear to them that that's not going to happen, and they ultimately end up becoming disillusioned and leaving to diplomatic service. And I think that going forward will just have an enormously detrimental effect on the institutional capacity of U.S. diplomacy to deal with things in the world. Finally, there are any number of specific policy pieces that I could just sort of yell and pull the hair that I don't have out about. If you've got 7 hours sometimes, let me share my views on the recently announced Trump peace plan for Israel-Palestine. I think the thing that is most worrying to me about things that the U.S. administration is doing that will have an effect in the world is actually not something that is happening so much in conventionally demarcated foreign policy spaces. And it's really the ways in which the interface between the domestic political forces in the United States that have enabled Trump and the current U.S. administration, the ways in which there are sort of transnational affinities between that segment of American political opinion and broader trends around right-wing populism around the world. So the idea of the Trump administration as the leadership of a global superpower that is simultaneously empowering global right-wing populism and authoritarian exclusivist nationalism in a wide variety of contexts is actually, to me, the most severe threat. It's not technically an aspect of U.S. foreign policy, and yet versions of this are manifold. So it's not just things that the Trump administration does that empowers right-wing groups, far-right groups, white supremacist groups in the United States, but who feel that they have top cover under Trump to be much more forward-leaning and overt and open than they ordinarily would. But it's the fact that the Narendra Modis of the world, the Bolsonaros of the world, any number of other heads of state empowered by similar kinds of social forces that are themselves engaged in various forms of complex transnational right-wing populist mobilization, much of it which is largely invisible to us. This to me is sort of we run the risk of this aggregating into I think, and potentially in very quick order, open violent conflict without this necessarily being a product of actual formal U.S. foreign policy and diplomatic responses. So that's the aspect of the U.S. administration that kind of has me most worried about it in terms of its effects in the world. And on that cheery note, I will stop.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Round of applause.